Welcome to History for Nap Time. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Every week, people from all over the world listen to these stories, and it's always amazing to see how far history travels. So, leave a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from, and then settle in. Because tonight, we're travelling into the quietest, hungriest corners of the past to learn what people ate when there was nothing left to eat. This isn't a story of feasts or kings, it's the story of survival, of families who looked into empty pots and found ways to keep living. From medieval villages to frozen northern farms, this is how hunger shaped Europe's memory and its soul. Hunger has no single age. It arrived in waves, again and again. A shadow that followed bad harvests, cold summers and wars. In medieval Europe, food was never guaranteed. Most people lived harvest to harvest. If the grain failed, if rain fell too long, or frost came too early, famine began not with noise, but with silence. First, the millstones stopped turning. Then the markets emptied. By winter, the smell of baking bread, that comforting scent that held the rhythm of village life, disappeared. The first to suffer were the poor. Peasants relied on barley, oats, and rye. When those spoiled, they turned to what nature offered: roots, weeds, bark, and moss. In northern Europe, pine bark was stripped, dried, ground, and mixed with what little flour remained, becoming bark bread, bitter and grey, but enough to fill the stomach. In the south, famine drove people to eat acorns, figs, and even grape skins left after wine pressing. Across France and Italy, chroniclers described villagers boiling straw, chestnuts, and the husks of grain that animals had already eaten. Famine was not a single event. It was a season that stretched for months, sometimes years, and when the granaries ran empty, so did hope. The poor man's meal was humble even before famine came. For most of medieval Europe's population, dinner meant a single bowl: coarse bread dipped into vegetable broth, with perhaps a hint of fat if fortune smiled. Meat was a luxury, fish a treat, and sugar unknown. The foundation of survival was pottage, a slow-boiled stew of grains, roots, and greens. Every region had its own version. In England, barley thickened the pot. In France, cabbage and leeks were staples. In Italy, lentils and beans softened in clay pots over the hearth. The richer you were, the more ingredients your pottage contained. But for the poor, it was mostly water flavoured by effort. Then came famine, and even that simmering comfort disappeared. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a disaster that swept from Ireland to Poland, began with rain. For months, Europe drowned. Rivers overflowed, cattle sank into mud, and grain sprouted green and rotted in the fields. Even preserved food spoiled in the damp air. Chroniclers described the sky as endlessly weeping. At first, the poor cut back, 1 meal a day instead of 2. Then they began mixing their flour with whatever they could find. Powdered peas, sawdust, bran, even ground nutshells. Mills worked day and night, but the flour they produced turned grey and bitter. Bakers could not hide it. Everyone tasted the same despair. People boiled grass, nettles, and field weeds. They gathered roots from the forest, sorrel, dock, burdock, and dandelion, and crushed them into soup. Children were sent to collect acorns, not for pigs this time, but for bread. They roasted and ground them into coarse powder, then mixed it with water and a pinch of salt. The result was more punishment than meal, but it kept the body upright. In England, one chronicler wrote that even horses, dogs, and cats were eaten. In France, rumours spread of people digging up old graves, but historians believe these were exaggerations, products of fear more than fact. The real horror was quieter, the slow, dull ache of hunger that stretched for years. When spring finally came, the survivors looked upon green fields not with joy, but with disbelief. They had learned the cruelest lesson of all, that hunger is patient. In the cold north, famine turned people into alchemists, transforming inedible things into something that resembled food. In Sweden and Finland, people peeled the inner bark from pine and birch trees. This thin white layer, called phloem, was dried, ground, and mixed with rye flour to create what they called bark bread. It was dark, bitter, and heavy. The smell of it baking was strange, halfway between bread and smoke. But when the body trembles from hunger, bitterness is a mercy. Some families in Norway used reindeer lichen instead. They boiled it in ash water to remove toxins, then ground it into paste. The result was moss cake, green, sour, but edible. In Finland, bark flour was so common during famines that it became part of the national memory. Centuries later, during the 19th century famines, people still use those same recipes passed down from the Middle Ages. Proof that desperation teaches skills that never fade. Further south, people became equally inventive. In Germany, hunger bread was made by mixing sawdust, straw, and ground beans with a handful of rye. Bakers were forbidden by law to sell it, but many did anyway, driven by need. In Italy, especially in Tuscany, people boiled grape skins and wine dregs left over from pressing. They called it brodo di fame, famine broth. In France, famine bread was made from crushed ferns and powdered acorns, baked into loaves so tough they had to be broken with hammers. Even the wealthy weren't immune. In Florence, noble families diluted their wine with water, rationed cheese, and sold jewellery to buy grain. But it was the poor who bore the true cost, scavenging, trading, and inventing their own recipes of survival. Across Europe, the line between food and non-food blurred. Clay mixed into dough made it heavier and longer lasting. Sawdust added bulk. What mattered was not taste, but texture, the illusion of fullness. Every loaf, every bowl of green soup, every piece of bark was an act of resistance. In famine, cooking became prayer. For medieval people, famine wasn't only a physical crisis, it was spiritual. They saw hunger as punishment from God, a test of faith, or a warning to repent. Church bells rang for fasting and prayer. Processions wound through muddy streets as barefoot priests begged heaven for rain, or for it to stop. In France, villagers built crosses in the fields, hoping to please the skies. In Italy, they carried relics through the streets to chase away hunger. But not everyone accepted divine silence quietly. Some blamed the rich for hoarding grain. Others turned on outsiders, Jews, foreigners, or even old women accused of witchcraft. When the stomach is empty, fear grows loud. Yet faith also kept people alive. Monasteries opened their gates to the starving, offering bread made from the last of their stores. In England, monks at St Albans recorded giving out thousands of loaves during the Great Famine, even as their own supplies ran thin. For the poor, every crumb of charity carried both gratitude and shame. Receiving bread meant surviving, but also admitting powerlessness. Still, they took it, because life, even when hollow, was sacred. Hunger hit children first, and hardest. When food grew scarce, mothers often went without so their children could eat. Chroniclers in the 14th century described villages where mothers chewed bark to soften it, then fed it to infants. In Ireland's later famines, women mixed boiled nettles and oatmeal to keep their babies alive. In Scandinavia, mothers walked miles to gather birch sap, squeezing it into small bottles as sweet nourishment for the young. But hunger takes its toll slowly. Children grew weak, their hair thin, their skin pale. Mothers prayed, wept, and worked until exhaustion overcame them. In one account from Germany, a priest wrote that the cries of hungry children were more terrible than thunder. Those words echo across centuries, not as drama but as truth. In times of famine, love was measured not in gifts, but in endurance. To give your last crust to a child was the most human act imaginable, and when famine ended, the survivors carried that memory for life. The smell of bread, the warmth of soup, the sound of grinding grain, these became sacred, reminders that plenty was never guaranteed. For many, the church was both a refuge and a mirror of the world's inequality. Monasteries owned vast lands, but they also ran soup kitchens, hospitals, and granaries. In times of famine, their gates became Europe's emergency shelters. In France and Italy, monasteries built guest houses, simple stone halls where travellers and beggars could eat. Bread was distributed every Sunday, beer and ale when possible. The poor waited outside, hands open, hoping for the charity of monks who lived by vows of poverty yet often controlled wealth. Some orders, like the Franciscans, took charity further. They left their cloisters to walk barefoot through towns, collecting food for the hungry. In England, parish priests organised bread days, where each household gave what they could. A crust here, a handful of barley there. It was never enough, but it reminded communities they were not alone. Still, famine exposed the limits of compassion. When scarcity deepened, even the holy had to choose, feed others or preserve their own. Some monasteries closed their gates, others traded salvation for labour, a bowl of soup in exchange for work in the fields. In the end, faith did not always stop hunger, but it softened its edge with small acts of mercy. As famine deepened, the market, once a place of community and chatter, became a theatre of desperation. On ordinary days, medieval marketplaces were vibrant. Bright cloths hung from stalls, the air thick with the scent of bread and cheese, merchants calling prices in a dozen dialects. But during famine, all colour drained away. Grain was king. Every sack of flour became treasure. Merchants locked their stores and waited for prices to rise. Bakers hid loaves beneath counters. Farmers who still had grain kept it buried, sometimes literally, in barrels hidden under barns. The cost of food rose daily. In Paris during the Great Famine, the price of wheat tripled within months. In England, a bushel of wheat that had cost 5 shillings rose to over 20. In Italy, riots broke out in Siena and Florence. Women, often the ones sent to buy food, were the first to cry out in the streets. In Germany, town councils passed bread laws limiting profit. Bakers caught cheating, using lighter loaves or false measures, were publicly punished, sometimes whipped through the market. Yet, behind closed doors, trade went on in whispers. A shadow economy grew. The hunger markets. There, desperate people sold everything. A cloak for a loaf, a tool for a handful of barley, sometimes even a child's labour for a week's worth of grain. The church condemned hoarding, calling it a mortal sin. He who keeps his grain from the hungry shall answer to God, preached a bishop in Liège in 1316. But many priests themselves faced empty cellars. Morality bends when survival is at stake. Not everyone succumbed to greed. Some towns organised communal ovens where all citizens could bake from shared stores. Others opened bread funds, public donations collected to feed the poorest. These small acts of cooperation, often led by women, became lifelines in the chaos. And yet, for many, famine felt like judgment, not just from heaven, but from one's neighbours, who deserved food, who had earned pity, who had cheated. No law, no prayer could answer those questions. In famine, the market revealed not just hunger, but humanity, both its cruelty and its grace. Famine always ended the same way, quietly. The rain stopped, or came at last. Fields turned green again, cattle returned to pastures. But the joy of the first harvest was never pure. Families returned to empty homes. Children had grown thin. Some neighbours were gone, and the memory of hunger stayed. After the Great Famine of 1315, Europe's population declined for decades. The Black Death that followed only deepened the wound. By the 15th century, entire villages had vanished from maps, and yet humanity rebuilt. Peasants replanted fields, communities dug deeper wells, built larger granaries, and learned to store grain against future loss. In the north, rye replaced fragile wheat. In the south, people diversified, olives, beans, barley, all to hedge against bad years. The lesson was written not in books but in the land itself. Prepare when you can, share when you must. Each recovery brought hope and humility. For even in abundance the shadow of hunger lingered, a quiet teacher reminding them of what could be lost. By the 16th century the Middle Ages had faded, but hunger had not. Europe entered a colder, darker time known as the Little Ice Age. Summers shrank. Winters grew longer and crueler. Frost came early and stayed. Between 1550 and 1700, entire generations faced cycles of hunger that felt endless. In France, vineyards froze. Wine turned to ice in the barrels. In England, the Thames froze thick enough to hold entire fairs. People skated, roasted meat, and danced on the ice, even as farmers nearby watched their crops die. In Scandinavia, snow fell in June. In Finland, the harvest of 1601 failed completely. Diaries from Germany and Switzerland tell of villages buried under snow for months, of wells freezing solid, of wolves descending into towns. In the Alps, glaciers advanced, swallowing farms and chapels. Whole valleys were abandoned. And with the cold came hunger, slow, creeping, absolute. People revived the recipes of their ancestors. In Sweden, they baked bark bread again. In Norway, reindeer lichen became a staple. In Poland, famine soup made of bran, straw and melted snow kept families alive through the 1690s. But there was also adaptation. Communities built grain stores, introduced hardier crops, and diversified their fields. Rye replaced wheat. Potatoes, brought from the New World, began to spread, quietly changing the fate of future famines. Even so, the human toll was staggering. In Finland's Great Hunger of 1696 to 1697, a quarter of the population died. In France, the famine of 1709, caused by one of the coldest winters in European history, froze birds mid-flight and left entire provinces starving. Yet, through the cold, people found warmth in one another. Families shared shelter. Monks opened their doors again. Neighbours gathered around frozen hearths and boiled whatever they had. Roots, bark, even leather soaked in broth. The Little Ice Age tested endurance beyond measure, but it also planted a new idea, that famine was not divine punishment, but something human beings could resist, even prevent, through preparation and cooperation. When the ice finally began to retreat in the 18th century, Europe was changed. New crops, new storage, new compassion, all born from centuries of suffering. And still, the old habits remained. The superstition against wasting bread, the reverence for grain, the quiet prayer before eating. Because those who had known hunger never forgot it. Hunger leaves no monuments, only habits, stories, and quiet scars. No one built statues for the people who boiled bark or ground acorns into bread. But their lessons linger, not in stone, but in how we eat, how we pray, and how we remember. Even centuries later, their echoes remain. In Northern Europe, old recipes for bark bread were whispered from grandmother to grandchild, long after famine had passed, not as food, but as a warning. In southern France, the phrase, "the years of grass soup" survived in folk songs, used to mark hard times. In Italy, the poorest families still gave thanks before breaking bread, touching it to their foreheads, a silent memory of when even crumbs were blessings. Across Europe, generations grew up hearing their elders say, "Finish what's on your plate." Those words, once born of necessity, became cultural truth, a remnant of centuries when wasting food was a sin against survival itself. Hunger taught humility. It taught people that comfort is fragile, that full bellies and warm hearths could vanish with one bad harvest, and in that fragility they found gratitude. When the Little Ice Age finally ended and new crops spread, the potato, maize, new grains, people began to believe they had conquered hunger. But old memories don't fade so easily. Even in abundance, there remained a reverence for the act of eating, for the quiet miracle of sharing food together. In villages from Finland to Sicily, families continued the same rituals. The prayer before meals, the tradition of setting aside the first loaf for the poor, the habit of saving stale bread for soup instead of throwing it away. These were not just customs, they were monuments of memory. And maybe that's the truest legacy of famine. It made humanity gentler. It reminded people that survival was not an individual achievement, but a shared one. That the hand offering bread was as sacred as the one receiving it. When we look back, it's easy to see only tragedy, the empty fields, the hollow faces. But if we listen closely, beneath that silence, we can still hear something else. The sound of life refusing to surrender. The crackle of bark in the fire, the bubbling of nettle soup in a clay pot, the whisper of prayers said over an empty table. All reminders that even in the bleakest winters, people found ways to live. And that perhaps is the lesson hunger left behind. That gratitude isn't born from plenty, but from endurance. From knowing that food is not just sustenance, but hope made tangible. So tonight, as you rest, think of them. The millions whose names are forgotten, but whose resilience built the world we live in. Every warm meal, every shared loaf, every moment of comfort, all of it is a quiet inheritance from those who once had nothing and kept going anyway. Because in the end, hunger was never just about food. It was about the human spirit, the unbroken will to survive, to care, and to keep believing that the spring would come again. And it did.